Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 119, and welcome to our second lecture examining this pivotal decade in the history of American consumer culture, the 1920s. In our first look at the 1920s, in our most recent lecture, we testified to all the ways in which the 1920s was a period of great enthusiasm for consumerism, with changes to the economy, greater availability of consumer goods, new forms of consumerism that developed in this period. We talked about how that greater access to consumer goods, the embrace of consumer goods, changed people's sense of time and space, and ultimately led to a great reverence, even worship of the businessmen who produced the gadgets and gizmos of this age. But we turn here in our second look at the 1920s to the other side of the story, the way in which, despite the great enthusiasm for consumerism in the 1920s, this was still a period of limits. We stressed in our very first lecture that consumerism often is interpreted along two schools of thought. There's the triumphalism way of thinking about consumerism, that consumer is good, positive, an emblem of progress. Now, in our first look at the 1920s, we certainly saw a great deal of evidence for that. But even in the 1920s, even in this period of great enthusiasm for consumerism, even in an age where the man nobody knows is flying off the shelves of bookstores and emerging as a best-selling book, there were still limits to consumerism that come out of the other thesis, the other way of thinking about consumerism, the domination point of view that was very suspicious about consumerism. And so we turn our attention to that, the other side of the 1920s, testifying to the complexity of this period and the overall field of debate that surrounds consumerism, how it is often seen in a triumphalist way, but also in a much more circumspect way, where Americans are suspicious of a nation in this decade so dedicated to consumerism. Certainly one good example of the limits on consumerism in the 1920s, Prohibition. 1920s was a period where, under a constitutional amendment ratified at the beginning of that decade, alcohol, the production and sale and consumption of alcohol, was prohibited. Now, this is an example of trying to limit consumerism to make a better world. As much as consumerism may have been celebrated in the ways we documented in our first lecture on the 1920s as the means to a better world, those who supported prohibition, those who supported banning this consumer product, alcohol, thought that reducing and eliminating the consumption of this consumer good would make for a better America. That if people did not buy and consume alcohol, we would emerge as a better nation. That here you could actually engender progress by limiting consumption. Now, the prohibitionist movement that eventually leads to the ratification of an amendment to the Constitution, the 18th Amendment, that would ban alcohol, comes out of a long-standing effort. It isn't something that spontaneously begins in the early 20th century. In fact, going back to the early 19th century, going back to the 1820s and 1830, there was beginning then a temperance movement, one that sought to dissuade people from drinking and ultimately ban the consumption of alcohol. So the very first prohibitionist movements began in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, when America was rapidly industrializing. And that's because consumption of alcohol did not fit with the demands of a now industrial economy. So in the 1820s and 1830s, you see the first large-scale efforts to dissuade people from consuming alcohol. Industrialists wanted a workforce that showed up sober, alert, on time. They were tasking their workers with operating complex machines, and so they didn't want some drunk guy breaking their spinning jenny or power loom. So as America began to industrialize in the first wave of industrialization, there came for the first time a moral judgment attached to the consumption of alcohol. Prior to the 1820s, 1830s, everyone drank. And when you drank alcohol in, say, the colonial period of the 1700s, it wasn't considered a moral failing. It wasn't considered a sin. People drank, ministers drank. In fact, historians tell us that in the 1700s, on average, Americans drank a pint of hard liquor every day. There is a book about early American history that says so much of early American history can be explained by the fact that everyone was shit-faced all the time. It's called the Alcoholic Republic. So prior to the 1820s and 1830s, consumption of alcohol was not considered a moral or social concern. It was something that everyone did because consumption of alcohol was really the safest way of consuming beverages. In the late 1700s, you didn't drink water. It's not like today where everyone's walking around with their water bottles of trice-filtered reverse osmosis water, right? Water was dangerous to drink because it was laden with pathogens. But in the process of brewing or distilling, that water is boiled, and so it's safe to drink. So people in the 1700s drank because, well, there's the pleasures associated with alcohol, but also it was the safest thing to drink. But in the 1820s, 1830s, that ends. And now drinking alcohol is considered immoral. And you get the beginnings of this temperance movement that would continue through the 1800s as America industrialized, with industrialists again favoring a sober, alert workforce that showed up on time, and therefore they became foes of alcohol. And then in the early 20th century, you had that progressive era, which we talked about, where there's this great enthusiasm for reform and change. We can make any world we want. The way things are isn't how they have to be. And we talked in our lecture on the progressive era how that played out in the consumer economy. But another aspect of the progressive era was this crusade against immorality. There were crusades against prostitution. There were crusades against all forms of vice, gambling, and alcohol by progressives who believed that you could make a better America by banning alcohol, that you would have less crime, less poverty, less social ills if people were not drinking. So what began in the early 19th century gets a great boost in the early 20th century in the progressive era. It continued to be favored by industrialists like Henry Ford, who again wanted a workforce that was sober, alert, would show up on time. And then you have the reform efforts of the progressive era that often targeted what were imagined to be sources of immorality and vice, and that's what helped advance the prohibitionist effort. With all of these elements, the progressive era, support for industrialists, and feminists, there was great momentum in the early decades of the 20th century to establish a ban on this particular consumer product. Feminists also were part of this. Now, the early 20th century, as I remarked in our first lecture on the 1920s, was a period of great social change, and one of the social changes of that period would be the 19th Amendment, which would grant at least white women the right to vote. That was the product of vigorous efforts by feminists in this period. So the early 20th century, the progressive era, was a time of greater advocacy by American women for things like the right to vote. But often feminists were also prohibitionists. They often argued for banning alcohol. So with feminism stronger in America, with women marching in the streets, often joining the peace movement, opposed to World War I, or active in supporting World War I by selling war bonds and crusading to support the war, with women so active in public and political life, campaigning for the right to vote, many of them also favored prohibition, and that meant the growing, swelling, powerful feminist movement also played a role in the adoption of a nationwide ban on this particular consumer product. Now, why did feminists support prohibition? It's not because they were the no-fun police. It's not because they were the moral scolds or Ned Flanders of America in this period. The reason why women often supported prohibition was that in this period, in the early 20th century, domestic violence is not considered a crime or a social problem. That term, domestic violence, is a very recent term. And it's only in the last few decades that we have begun to start to treat this as a crime and social problem. So when women were beaten by their husbands in the early 20th century, they couldn't call the police. The police considered it a private matter, not a public concern. There was acceptance that men had this right to beat their wives, and so that's often why feminists favored prohibition, because they reasoned that if men weren't drinking so much, if they weren't so drunk all the time, they would be less likely to abuse their children and their wives. When women could not go to the police for protection, they often sought other means to protect themselves and their children from domestic violence. So the reason why women were often advocates for prohibition, joining urban reformers, employers, industrialists in this progressive era, was simply to protect themselves when the state, when local police forces refused to do so. Another influence on prohibition came out of World War I, where America went to war with Germany. And all things German, as a result, were seen as suspect and potentially un-American. During World War I, there was this great antipathy to all things German, and unfortunately that fell upon German Americans or immigrants from Germany who had come to the United States prior to World War I. In World War I, Americans were encouraged to see all things German as suspect, un-American. That's why we renamed the hamburger in World War I the Liberty Sandwich. Set aside the fact that the hamburger was invented in America. There's nothing German about it. But because the first few letters of that sandwich spell out a city in Germany, we couldn't call it the hamburger, so we call it the Liberty Sandwich. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. There were all kinds of silly ways in which Americans expressed their anti-German sentiments in World War I, but a less silly and much more unnerving example was the way in which so many German immigrants and German Americans born here, citizens of this country, were treated as un-American, suspect in World War I. This is important in building support for prohibition because so many brewers of beer in the United States were of German descent. People like Adolphus Busch, the founder of Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser, the Miller family. So many of the big brewers in America were of German descent, beer in many ways, deeply influenced by Germany. And so that anti-German sentiment, that suspicion of immigrants, particularly of Germans, also played a role in ultimately the ratification of the 18th Amendment. Now, even as early as 1915, many states had banned alcohol, and even states that had not, within those states, there were counties that had banned alcohol. But by the tail end of the Progressive Era, owing to all of these influences, the efforts of feminists in an age of more feminism and an assertive role by women, industrialists, the Progressive Era, the anti-German sensibilities that came with World War I, by the end of the Progressive Era, an amendment to the Constitution that in one fell swoop would ban alcohol in all states passes and is scheduled to go into effect on New Year's Day 1920 as this new decade began. So this first slide introduces us to the origins and context for how in a decade so dedicated to consumerism, as we talked about in our first lecture. In our first lecture, we gave many examples and insights regarding how the 1920s is this period of great enthusiasm for consumer goods and an expanded consumer culture in that same decade. One particular consumer good, one that had been consumed throughout human history and certainly had been a key part of American history, was banned. The 18th Amendment banned the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol, a key marker of how the 1920s was a period, like in all of American history, where consumerism is under debate. And this idea of a better America through consumerism could be expressed as much by limiting consumption as calling for its greater expansion in this age of industrial freedom. One impact of prohibition was the way in which many Americans welcomed this as part of a crusade of moral uplift and indeed a way to make America better, more moral, through limiting consumption. The prohibitionists supported this. They believed that less consumption of at least this consumer good would be part of a better America. Their vision of progress was an anti-consumerist vision, one that at least called for banning this consumer good. And it plays out in the context of a major religious revival in American history in the 1920s, many Americans reacting to what was seen as the failures of the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Many Americans who witnessed the horrors and death and destruction of World War I cleaved in a very conservative, reactionary, and religious way in the 1920s. As much as the 1920s was an age of more libertine values, women in short skirts, dancing the Lindy Hop, the first birth control clinics, opening in America widespread embrace of Freudian thought. As much as the 1920s is often remembered as a time of more libertine values, it was also a time of a massive religious revival, particularly active in rural areas, that called for fundamentalism, a fundamentalist approach to the Bible. Living strictly according to the Bible was the age where John T. Scopes would be arrested for daring to teach evolution in public schools. So the 1920s is a strange time. Hopefully we're starting to get a sense of that here as we talk about this back and forth, this jousting between consumerist enthusiasm and an anti-consumerist era of limits. As much as the 1920s was a time of more libertine values about gender and sexuality, it was also a time of a massive religious revival, a fundamentalist revival, one deeply suspicious of science and modernity, where you are arrested for teaching evolution in public schools. That was part of a massive religious revival that argued for prohibition, argued for austerity in a larger sense, a suspicion about pleasure, but in particular argued for an outright ban on this consumer good to make a better America. So here we really have a good sense of not just the complexity of the 1920s, but again that sort of jousting between different positions regarding consumerism. Is consumerism good or bad? Well, we documented in many ways in our first lecture on the 1920s all the ways in which Americans were encouraged to see consumerism as good, a better America, progress, an ideal way of living, a phonograph in your suburban home, a car in your garage. In that same decade, you have prohibition, where other Americans are arguing at least this particular consumer good must be prohibited in order to make a better America. However, not all Americans agreed. And another way of thinking about the complexity of the 1920s and consumerism as a field of argument. Consumerism as a source of debate is the fact that many Americans saw prohibition as a violation of their freedom, that here the government was telling you what you could or could not consume. The government was telling you what you could or could not put into your body. And so many Americans openly broke this law. Prohibition did not turn us into a dry nation where we no longer drank. It in many ways turned us into a nation of lawbreakers, where people who insisted on drinking, people who wanted to be able to buy and consume this product, were willing to break the law to do so. And when they did so, they were making a statement. When people broke this law, they weren't just saying, I want to get drunk, I want to drink. They were making a claim to freedom by saying, I will decide what to put inside my bodies. I will not accept the government telling me what I can and cannot consume. So it was a political act. Speakeasies proliferate in this period. Secret clubs in urban areas where if you knew the secret knock or secret password, you could come in and drink illicit alcohol. That was often brought in across the Canadian border to major American cities like Detroit and New York that bordered the Canadian border. Canada didn't ban alcohol in the 1920s, so they were still producing whiskey and beer. A lot of illicit, illegal alcohol made its way to those urban areas in the north across the Canadian border. Estimates range in the hundreds of thousands of speakeasies in New York City alone that operated each day in New York City, so that again, people could go there and drink if they knew the secret knock or the password. In rural areas, bootleggers illegally produced alcohol and then rushed it to urban areas. So far outside the purview of the police in distant rural areas, they could produce bathtub gin, illicit alcohol, and then rush it through automobiles to urban America and satisfy that desire for alcohol. Some see the beginnings of hot rod culture, car racing, NASCAR in these bootleggers who would take stock cars that they bought off the lot, and then manipulate the exhaust, manipulate the engine to get a little bit more horsepower so they could outrun the police. And as a result, many people see Prohibition as the beginning of hot rods, of racing, of NASCAR. I know it's a great shock to imagine that there's some sort of connection between alcohol and NASCAR, but I'm here to break that shocking story to you here. Bootleggers often manipulated the exhaust, the engine of their stock cars so that they could outrun the police who were stuck with that stock car that hadn't yet been souped up in that fashion. So again, Prohibition didn't make us a dry nation. It made us a nation of lawbreakers. Through bootleggers and gangsters and speakeasies, Americans could still procure this consumer good. And when they drank that alcohol, they were making a statement. That also brings us to that idea of consumer culture, where consumer goods are freighted and loaded with cultural and social meaning. How it isn't just the product. Certainly people wanted to buy alcohol in the 1920s because it's alcohol, and if you drink it, you feel good, right? But it was also a political statement. I'll decide what to put inside my body. When people were drinking alcohol, they were not just consuming an intoxicating beverage, they were making a political and personal statement. They were stylizing their existence. So it was the defiance of the law. It was engaged in this illegal act of consumerism where, once again, people could craft an identity, express themselves as individuals, all the ways in which consumer goods aren't just consumer goods. They're gateways to expression. They're ways of, again, stylizing our existence and expressing cultural values for people breaking the law in speakeasies. The cultural value they're expressing was one of personal freedom that came through violating the law. In 1920, some of the most popular films in an age where, as we've said now many times, cinema, a consumer product and consumer good itself, is increasingly popular and expanding its market. Some of the most popular films of this great era of cinema were gangster movies, where the gangster is involved in this illicit trade of alcohol, where he is part of this network of speakeasies and connected to bootleggers. And ostensibly in those films, the gangster's the bad guy. He's the criminal, right? But a lot of American film audiences who went to these movies in this heyday of the Hollywood cinema either secretly or openly cheered on the bad guy because they identified with the gangster. They identified with the people who were breaking a law that many saw as unfair, unjust. They liked the gangster who was breaking the law to facilitate access to alcohol. In the 1920s, the government labeled Al Capone, Scarface Al Capone, whose career and rise through the Chicago Mafia was really made possible thanks to Prohibition. The FBI identified him as public enemy number one. But to a lot of Americans, Al Capone was a hero because, again, he was the guy breaking the law so that you could enjoy the freedom associated with consuming alcohol. So Prohibition is an interesting center, a place, a locus to see this jousting, this argument that comes from consumerism. For those who supported Prohibition, this is good. By limiting access to this consumer good, we'll cleanse America of sin. We'll get back right with God. You'll see social and moral uplift. But for other Americans, this was a violation of personal freedom, a personal freedom that was largely tied to consumerism. I should be able to buy what I want when I want. In our first lecture on the 1920s, we talked about the availability of consumer credit, where you could buy what you wanted even if you didn't have the money. You'll just pay it off on time. The ethos, the spirit of the 1920s was unbridled, unreserved consumerism. You can have what you want when you want it. A new wonderland at your fingertips. Prohibition ran against that. It said, you can buy that, but you can't buy this. You can have a new car and a furniture set, but you can't have beer and whiskey. And that indicates, again, the complexities of the 1920s, where consumerism was in some ways more prevalent and available, but other consumer goods were strictly regulated. 1920s celebrated this idea of freedom associated with consumerism, celebrated the businessmen who made these consumer goods possible. But also the 1920s was the era of prohibition, where Americans were also told, but this one consumer good, this one you've been consuming for generations, you can't secure that particular consumer good. And so it really speaks to, again, how consumerism is a field of debate and contest. There was such a blowback to prohibition. There was such a problem enforcing it. It was so unpopular that it didn't last very long. In 1933, another amendment was added to the Constitution, the 21st Amendment, that reversed the 18th and allowed liquor to flow anew, liquor to flow once again. The only way to change an amendment to the Constitution is with another amendment. So we began the 1920s with an amendment, the 18th Amendment, that banned alcohol. And though many supported it, it proved to be extremely unpopular, hard to enforce. And also, another factor in ending prohibition was that the federal government relied a lot on taxes on alcohol for revenue. And so it wanted to sell alcohol again so that it could have the tax revenue associated with it. And all this, of course, led to, in 1933, the adoption of the 21st Amendment, which let you get drunk all over again. When Franklin Roosevelt comes in 1933, in the throes and the thickets of the Depression, more about that in our next lecture, one of the most popular things he did was support the end of Prohibition. And during a Great Depression where Americans were out of work and facing this dire economic condition, well, hell, now you can at least get drunk. But Prohibition, though it's a brief 13-year period in American history, is very revelatory as to the limits of consumerism in the 1920s, where there were certain things you couldn't buy, the way in which people saw that as good, as a catalyst to moral uplift, and then also with this blowback, this resistance to prohibition, good evidence for us here about how consumerism is this field of argument and debate, whether or not more consumerism or less consumerism is good for America. Also along those lines, the debate over consumerism, you have in the 1920s the popularity of Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a retired baseball player who himself had a religious conversion amidst the religious revival of the 1920s. He claimed to have been visited by God and given a task to go around this country and spread his word, the word of God. So Billy Sunday was a revivalist preacher, an itinerant preacher who went town to town. He had a very passionate and flamboyant style. He would take to the stage with no notes, seemingly indicating God was indeed inside him, known to him intuitively. He claimed to have an awakening where God spoke to him, and he seemed to prove that by the way in which he could speak extemporaneously without notes about God's word. He took to the pulpit with no notes and spoke with great passion, a flamboyant style that got people enthused, ecstatic. He would have a huge crowd surrounding him, as you could see in this photograph. It's kind of hard to see Billy Sunday. It's like playing Where's Waldo? Where is he? Well, that's because he's surrounded by this throng of people. He's up there on the stage with no notes, no PowerPoints, no laser light shows, and yet he's got this crowd captive in the palm of his hand, with his sermons that were very anti-consumerist, critical of this idea of pleasure through stuff, critical of this idea of a celebrity age where people spent their leisure time watching movies, immersed in the travails of movie stars, sports stars. Ironically, Billy Sunday was a bit of a celebrity himself, though he denounced a celebrity culture and sin and temptation. He bragged in his autobiography that over the course of his life, he had preached to over 100 million people. Now, some believe that that is a brag, a boast, but many historians who don't have the same interest in inflating such numbers have argued maybe he wasn't too far off the mark because he was so popular. Billy Sunday's sermons were very critical of pleasure through the marketplace, pleasure through stuff. He denounced sin and temptation. He urged Americans to get back right with God, to live strictly according to the Bible, to reject the dominant culture that seemed to be so dedicated to cars, movies, and celebrities. His popularity, his resonance, his appeal indicates how many Americans in the 1920s were suspicious that the good life was a matter of profligacy, that the good life was one of spending money to buy stuff, that the good life could be found through suburban homes and automobiles. Billy Sunday offered a different vision of the good life, one that was a very anti-consumerist ethic. The history of consumerism is also the history of anti-consumerism. We've already seen that as we've looked at many people who are suspicious of a new modern age defined by stuff, and we'll continue to see it, and it certainly is true in America today, where here in the 21st century you have an environmentalist movement that's very critical of waste and profligacy. Many other movements today, the effort to get people off the internet, turn off your TV, live simply so others can simply live. These are contemporary examples of how the history of consumerism is often met with a backlash and rejection, an anti-consumerist perspective. In the 1920s, you had great enthusiasm for consumerism in the ways we documented in our first lecture, but it's also the era where Billy Sunday is holding crowds like this captive with his anti-consumerist message that denounced pleasure through stuff and mindless, lavish devotion to consumer goods, that urge you to worship God rather than Henry Ford and Herbert Hoover, the rich businessmen. So here is further evidence of how the 1920s was a time where consumerism is subject to debate. And Billy Sunday's popularity speaks to how many Americans in this period who connected with his message continue to be deeply suspicious of a better life defined by consumerism and materialism, how even in this decade of such great enthusiasm for consumerism, an anti-consumerist message could take root and prove to be so popular. So, in the second lecture, as we examine the 1920s from a different perspective, we understand consumerism as part of a field of debate. How consumerism is often met with impulses of anti-consumerism. We've seen that with prohibition prevailing in this decade, and now with Billy Sunday. The triumphalists intertwine with the domination thesis. The celebrants of big business also subject to rebuke from crusaders like Sunday, who offer a different argument of progress, a different argument of meaning, a different call for priorities that do not come from corporate America. And this is a good window into the 1920s and its complexities, and it's a good way of understanding the totality of what we examine in this class, because all periods are marked by this jousting. Even our time today in the 21st century, marked by this jousting, this argument about the worth of consumerism. 1920s was a period where feminists who had achieved major gains in the progressive era hoped to advance those gains further. I mentioned earlier that the Progressive Era was a time of rising feminism where women were increasingly interjecting themselves into social and political debates, demanding the right to vote, and crusading against alcohol. And after the 19th Amendment was ratified that granted women the vote, but effectively allowed only white women to vote, many feminists hoped to build on that in line with this new vision of American womanhood, the new woman, a new ideal, a new icon, a new archetype of womanhood that argued women should be more engaged in political life. The new woman ideal emerged in the Progressive Era among young feminists active in the suffragette campaign, and it was an image of womanhood that celebrated women involved in public and political life. It countered the 19th century Victorian ideal of separate spheres that argued that the public and political realm was the sphere for men, and the private and familial realm was the realm for women. The new woman assailed that, countered that, and said, no, women should be involved in public and political life, and we should see that as an ideal. So from that came this image of the new woman, a new woman for a new century. As the 20th century began, as the Progressive Era began, young feminists embraced this new ideal of the new woman. And they hoped that through these efforts, through their advocacy, the goals of feminism, many of which reach as well back to the early 19th century, could finally be achieved. They hoped that through the course of their advocacy, we could end discrimination against women and open up a field of opportunity for women to pursue a career, an education, a life of their own making. The 19th Amendment was a great achievement along those lines. The 19th Amendment says you cannot deny someone the right to vote based on sex, and therefore millions of people who had been previously forbidden to vote could now do so. And feminists embracing this new woman ideal, this idea of women active in public and political life, hope to build on that 19th Amendment and pass further amendments like the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first championed and advanced in the 1920s. But that's not what happens. Instead, the cause of political liberation stalled in the 1920s. 1920s, as much as, again, it might have been an era of more libertine values, with women cutting their hair short, dancing the Lindy Hop in short skirts, challenging gender norms and ideologies, with the first birth control clinics opening in America, allowing women to have greater control over their bodies. 1920s, though, was also an era of Billy Sunday, a religious revival, a conservative reactionary period. It's a weird schizophrenic time in American life where we are simultaneously becoming more libertine but also more conservative. There's a backlash to feminism in the 1920s as part of that reactionary conservative turn, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which was for feminists hopefully to be the next major achievement, doesn't pass. And it still hasn't passed even now in the 21st century. And what happens is that what began as a political image and a political argument for female equality and liberty becomes now co-opted by corporate America and marketing and turned into a commodified image. This often happens in American culture, American history, and in particular in consumer culture, where something that emerged immediately as a political image and message gets co-opted and turned into something to sell products or something marketed. Quite often in American history, images and ideas of transgression, images and ideas that begin as revolutionary, critical of existing institutions and inequities in power, or icons of rebellion go through what I like to call this cultural car wash, where they lose a lot of that political element and they emerge as squeaky clean mainstream images. This often happens in consumer culture. This often happens in popular culture. When Elvis appeared in the 1950s, he represented rebellion. He had long hair at a time in which American men were encouraged to have brush-cut, army-like haircuts. He fussed with his hair. He wore flashy clothing at a time where American men in the 1950s were encouraged to wear gray flannel suits. He sang black blues songs, Elvis, and brought that style of music to white teenagers. He was sexual. He was flashy. He was everything that the staid, conformist 1950s rejected. And so when Elvis first appeared, when rock and roll first appeared, it was rebellious, it was new, it was sexual, it was aggressive, it was loud. But by the late 50s, Elvis is drafted. He goes off and serves in the army. His long locks are literally sheared by an army barber. Jerry Lee Lewis marries his 12-year-old cousin and causes outrage. Chuck Berry is arrested for taking a woman across state lines that wasn't his wife. A lot of the icons of rock and roll get domesticated or forced underground, or in some ways go through this process of dilution where they lose their rebellious bona fides. And that makes rock and roll palatable, acceptable. By the early 60s, rock and roll is boring and mainstream. It's saccharine. It's filled with teen idols singing syrupy songs about puppy love. It will take the British invasion in the 60s. It will take the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to make rock and roll rebellious again. So Elvis went through that car wash. Elvis and rock and roll, which initially seemed so restive and rebellious, eventually gets diluted into something palatable, marketable, mainstream, and acceptable. There are many examples of this where in American history, and particularly in American consumer culture, something that initially was a political force for change gets diluted, goes through that cultural car wash, and then becomes acceptable, mainstream. Hip-hop, very similar, right? In the 80s, there was this big national freak out about hip-hop, right? Young, aggressive African-American men singing about police brutality, singing about sexuality. There were efforts to slap stickers on these CDs, a great national freak out about gangsta rap. Well, where are those guys now? Let's see. Ice Cube, one of the leading figures associated with that gangster rap movement of the 80s that caused white freak out, white panic. Well, now he makes movies about going on an RV adventure with your kids, right? Ice-T, who caused a great sensation in the late 80s with a song called Cop Killer. He now plays a cop on TV on Law & Order. And hip-hop is now mainstream. It's no longer seen as transgressive. It's in many ways the soundtrack of America. You know, white teenagers in the Midwest have a Tupac poster in their bedroom. Your grandma has Beyonce as a ringtone, right? It's boring, it's mainstream, it's no longer transgressive. And that's what happened with the New Woman. The New Woman was a political movement that came out of feminism in the early 20th century. It said we need to break down barriers and offer opportunities to American women. Women should have the right to vote. Women should be able to pursue a career. Women should have equal rights. When that movement was thwarted by a conservative reactionary backlash in the 1920s, Coca-Cola, Ford Motor Company, co-opt the image of a new woman and use it to sell cars, cigarettes, and soda. And this is not isolated to one element of the 1920s that demonstrated how 1920s limited political expression by diluting this image. It's true throughout consumer culture, with rock and roll, with hip-hop, with Muhammad Ali, who in the 60s was the most hated man in America, and then later is given this treatment as an American hero. It's something you often see in the sober, smart study of consumer culture. How did this new woman ideal get commodified? Well, it was turned into an image known as the flapper. Now, the flapper was a real experience for certain Americans in urban areas who cut their hair short, who flouted the law by drinking in public, going to speakeasies, smoking in public. But that lived reality of some American women gets detached from that social movement and expression and used in ads marketed to American women. So it becomes simply an image that can be appropriated and employed in marketing, detached from its real roots in social and political movements. The flapper was a lived reality for urban-dwelling American women who wanted to cut their hair short, express their sexuality in public, swooning over matinee idols like Valentino, saying, "We have a libido too. We have a sex drive too." When birth control clinics were for the first time widely available and women could enjoy sex simply for the pleasure of sex without reproduction. But that lived reality for some American women in cities, which was socially transgressive, politically transgressive, challenging the existing sexism of this age, ultimately gets removed from that and begins to appear in mainstream images coming out of corporate America, demonstrating, again, a big theme in American consumer culture, how transgressive figures go through that cultural car wash and are eventually co-opted by corporate America, by our consumer culture, as something to be sold to the masses, i.e. hip-hop. But here in this context, it again represents the limits of expression in the 1920s through consumerism, where political ideas get muted in this fashion, reduced to commodified images here of the new woman. When cigarettes were first marketed to American women in the 1920s, 1920s was the first time where cigarettes were directly marketed to American women. When the cigarette industry developed in the late 19th century, thanks to the efforts of James Duke, cigarette advertisers refused to recognize that women were their consumers too, even though they were. In the Victorian sensibilities of the late 19th century, it was considered taboo to acknowledge women smoke too. 1920s, those taboos melted away because, hell, why limit your appeals to just half of the population? Women, their money's green too. And so Lucky Strike and other cigarette manufacturers now openly marketed cigarettes directly to American women. And when they did so, when cigarettes were first marketed to American women, they were labeled torches of freedom. If you look at ads from the 1920s, cigarettes directed to American women, they refer to these cigarettes as, quote, torches of freedom. Ladies, when you are sucking on a cigarette, you're not inhaling a cancer stick. No, 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 no. That's a torch of freedom. And here's a good concrete piece of evidence of how that flapper new woman, liberated, politically active woman, and the ideals of freedom associated with that political advocacy get reduced to consumerist messages. The idea of cigarettes as torches of freedom meant that these consumer products symbolize you as a modern, liberated, free woman. You're a free woman not because you can vote, you can attend a university, you can decide on a life of your own making. You're a free woman because you can smoke. And these cigarettes represent torches of that freedom. So here's a great way of how something that is political, a campaign for liberation, a campaign for female empowerment, gets used to sell, in this case, cigarettes. A couple examples of this. On the left, there is that image of the flapper, short hair, short skirt, oh my, showing lots of leg in a Coca-Cola ad of the 1920s. Taking this icon of feminism and using it to sell sugar water. On the right, one of the ads geared towards American women for cigarettes. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's really the 1920s that for the first time you see cigarette manufacturers directly marketing to American women. The woman in this ad, clearly, again, in that new woman ideal, short hair, a young woman. And in the ad copy, they'll refer to the cigarette as a torch of freedom. Again, you prove you're modern and liberated and free by buying this product. But also look at the way in which the largest text in this ad is geared towards women by saying if you smoke cigarettes, you won't be fat, and so you'll be more attractive to men. There's nothing feminist about this. There's nothing free or liberating about it, right? Here they're co-opting that image and using it to sell cigarettes and reinforce patriarchy, reinforce the idea that women's only value is in their bodies. Their only value is in their appeal to men. So both of these images, again, give us a good example of the limits of this period, where women, through consumerism, are reduced to unfree status, where the political cause of freedom is muted to sell cigarettes marketed to women so they'll be more physically appealing to men. Another barrier to consumerism in this period, in addition to sex, race. Another example of the limits of consumerism in this decade of great enthusiasm for consumerism concerned racial disparities and the way in which so many racial minorities in America were cut off to this good life defined by stuff. They often were denied employment in jobs that paid higher wages in an era of employment discrimination. And so they were not accessing those roaring 20 elements of the economy that we talked about. That's why I used the term relative affluence in the previous lecture. Because yes, some were enjoying a booming, roaring economy and the high wages that went along with it, but what if you were forbidden to work in those jobs through widespread racial discrimination and employment? A lot of the good-paying jobs required you to join a union, and unions could openly discriminate based on race, foreclosing African Americans and other racial minorities from accessing the type of jobs that allowed them to participate in the consumer economy. And the consumer realm itself, where you engaged in consumerism, was marked by racism and discrimination. The early 20th century is an era of Jim Crow apartheid in this country, where public space in America, public space where consumerism takes place, is strictly segregated by race. Theaters, restaurants, stores, sports. Jackie Robinson won't break the color barrier in baseball for decades later, until after World War II. Jack Johnson, in the progressive era, had been the first African American to win the world heavyweight boxing title, but after he loses that title, another black American won't be able to fight for and hold the title until the 1930s. So a big aspect of the consumer industrial age, the advent of professional sports in urban America, that too was foreclosed to racial minorities, both as participants on the field and spectators in the stands. We talked in our first lecture about the 1920s about home ownership. Well, African Americans and other racial minorities were forbidden to buy homes. They could not secure those low down payment, low interest loans. So all that's involved in home ownership as a field of consumerism and wealth building, this is a key point to understand a lot of the contemporary debates now in the 21st century about inequities in wealth and power. The number one way Americans build wealth is through home ownership. That's how we build wealth. That's how we retire. Americans don't retire by saving money. Hell no, we're Americans, damn it. We don't save money. We often retire through the greater equity that comes with our homes as they accrue in value. It's how we leave money to our heirs through home ownership. It's how we borrow money to send our kids to college. So The number one way Americans build wealth is through home ownership. Well, what if for a century you've been denied the chance to buy homes or limited in the homes you could buy? Thanks to a variety of practices enforced in the 1920s and well into the 1960s that made it impossible for racial minorities to buy homes. In the 1920s, redlining was common, where banks would draw a line on the map and say, we're not going to loan to people buying in that region, enforcing racial segregation. When in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration develops, it will only guarantee loans that go to white buyers. A lot of homes built in the 1920s in this wave of suburbanization had racial covenants written into them, where if you bought the house, the deed said you can never sell this house to a variety of racial and religious minorities. You can't sell this to Latinos and African Americans and Jews and Catholics. Perhaps the house you're living in or grew up in originally had such a racial covenant before such actions were eventually overturned in the civil rights era. Here in the 1920s, we are in the throes and thickets of Jim Crow America, apartheid America, where segregation and discrimination in housing is the rule, not the exception, enforced by private banks, enforced by a government that often segregated certain parts of cities. When, in the Great Migration, African Americans made their way to northern cities, they were often locked into certain urban areas because they could not buy or rent homes where they chose. They were segregated in that fashion. The mayor of Baltimore in the 1920s, responding to a large influx of African Americans into that city, said, we're going to quote, this is the exact word he used, quarantine the black population. Treat them like a virus. And so African Americans have never been granted what white Americans were able in easier ways to procure in the 1920s, chance to buy a home, build wealth, pass wealth on to the next generation. And that really helps you understand a lot of the inequities we see in wealth and power today as a result of over a century of segregation based on race and housing. Not only did that have deleterious effects for African Americans and other racial minorities economically, but it also meant they could not enjoy the pleasures, comforts, expressions that went along with home ownership that we talked about. That was only for white Americans who could move out to the suburbs. When African Americans were subject to this residential segregation, it meant they could not buy homes and build wealth. It meant they were denied the pleasures, comforts, the exclusivity and privacy that went along with home ownership. And it meant that they were captive in certain parts of cities where they could be subject to gouging and exploitation with high rents. It's another sometimes unappreciated, ununderstood element of residential segregation. In a free market where you can move wherever you want, if you don't like what the landlord's charging you in rent, well, you just uproot and move, right? What if you can't move? What if you are forbidden to move and the landlord knows it? He can jack up the rent. He can gouge you. It's a form of legalized theft. That was the fate for racial minorities in this decade that, again, on its surface, seems to be one of expanded home ownership. Home ownership for whom? Really speaks to the limits of prosperity and opportunity in the 1920s. A lot of popular culture in the 1920s trafficked in racism. Another way in which race proved to be an inhibitor in the consumer economy of the 1920s was in the popular culture, the consumer expressions of entertainment in this period. I mentioned in our first lecture on the 1920s that the 1920s was the heyday of radio, where more and more Americans were on time, on credit, buying radios and enjoying entertainment in their home. And the most popular radio program in the late 20s was a radio program called The Adventures of Amos and Andy. Many historians cite the popularity of this one show as a reason why so many Americans went to buy a radio, because they wanted to hear this show in the privacy of their own home. Amos and Andy was a radio program that premiered in the late 20s, first in Chicago and then beamed around the country, that featured two white men in what we might describe as black voice, appearing on the air as not just the titular characters of Amos and Andy, but a variety of other characters presenting themselves as black men. The two men behind this radio program, named Gosden and Carell, began their entertainment careers in minstrel shows. Minstrel shows began in America in the early 1800s. They are a uniquely American form of theater that involved white people in blackface going on stage and presenting themselves as African Americans, and in doing so, trafficking in the worst, most pernicious racist stereotypes, many of which that still endure, sadly, tragically, to this day. Gosden and Carell, the two men behind Amos and Andy, who would star in the radio program, began their career in the late 1800s in minstrel shows, and then they took their act to the air, taking that established form of entertainment and now literally electrifying it, amplifying it through the broadcast of this new medium of radio. They would go on to earn salaries over $100,000 a year in the 1930s, the highest paid celebrities, earning more than movie stars like Charlie Chaplin or sports stars like Babe Ruth. So this element of our consumer culture, this element of our popular culture, the radio, was a means for trafficking in the minstrel show tradition. And later, in the 1950s, the Amos and Andy radio program would premiere as a TV program, adapting to that next medium, entering American homes all over again. Is it any wonder that this noxious and terrible cultural phenomenon of blackface endures? It never goes away. That's why even in the 21st century, there's always another blackface controversy, because it is so well ingrained in our culture and continues to come back in new mediums, now the internet. In the 1920s, this is what stood as consumer entertainment, the Amos and Andy program. 1920 is a weird time. Yeah, it's a time of libertine values, modernity, expanded consumerism, but it's also a time of a massive religious revival, prohibition, a return and expansion of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan would enjoy a heyday in the 1920s. They would march en masse in Washington, D.C. They established new chapters in the North, here in the West, in places like the Inland Empire. The very first Klan chapters are formed in the 1920s. It's not often when you think of the 1920s, right? You know, speakeasies, dancing the Lindy Hop. Yeah, well, it's also the heyday of the Klan. 1924, the nation passed its first major immigration restrictions. There had been previous restrictions against immigrants from China, the Chinese Exclusion Act, gentleman's agreement that banned immigration from Japan. But in 1924, we effectively cut off our borders from almost all immigration, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, in response to an anti-immigrant, nativist sentiment. So the 1920s was as much a period of modernity, Art Deco, libertine values, a very conservative and reactionary period of racial animosity, race riots breaking out like that Tulsa race riot of 1921, where hundreds of African Americans were killed. The entire black section of Tulsa burned to the ground. City of Tulsa in 1921 had an airplane, one of the very first cities to have an airplane. And they flew the airplane over the black section of that city, and they bombed citizens of this country. Black Americans who had come to Tulsa looking for a better life were bombed by their own government. The very first Americans to be bombed from the air weren't at Pearl Harbor in 1941. They were black Americans who just wanted a better life and were killed in the Tulsa race riot of 21. And it was just one of many forms of violence. So if you look at the experience of racial minorities in the 1920s, it doesn't seem to be an age of prosperity, opportunity, and endless abundance, along with the other elements that we've encountered in this lecture, the anti-feminist sensibility that we talked about in our most recent slides, prohibition. There are serious limits to this idea of consumerism and abundance in the 1920s. In our final slide, we'll offer one last example that presages where we're going. Both of these lectures in the 1920s end on an ominous note because we know where we're going. We have the benefit of hindsight, right? We know in 1929 the stock market will crash and a Great Depression will begin that will usher in a very different age in American consumer culture and with it American history. In our final slide in this lecture on the 1920s, speaking to the limits of prosperity and opportunity, we presage that trend, that coming apocalypse of the Great Depression. Lincoln Steffens was a progressive who supported radical change that would ameliorate the inequities of the Gilded Age. But in the 1920s, he argued that big business is producing what socialists had long hoped for, of equality and opportunity for all, abundance for all. Steffens had to concede to that mantra and ethos of the 1920s that what's good for big business is good for us all, that a rising tide will lift all boats. But as much as Steffens and others might testify to what seemed to be the triumph of big business, its ability to create abundance and opportunity for all, there were fractures and limits underneath that, again, gilded exterior. 1920s was a period of growing disparity once again between rich and poor, where corporate America was profiting immensely, but even with Fordism and the embrace of higher wages for workers, the profits for corporate America grew much faster than the rate of wages for middle class and working class Americans. It was once again increasingly becoming a nation of haves and have-nots, where lowering the tax on wealthy Americans, deregulating big business, allowed businessmen to gobble up resources so that 1% of the nation's banks controlled half of the nation's financial resources. There's a lot of consolidation in the 1920s. The Progressive era was often targeting monopolies and trying to break up trusts and other monopolistic forms of business and create greater competition. But in the rejection of the Progressive era, once again, with deregulation, it became possible for industrialists to consolidate, to buy up their competitors. You see this in the auto industry. In the early 20th century, there were literally hundreds of companies making automobiles. Lots of competition. But when auto production becomes big business, when you need big capital investment, you need large factories that can mass produce hundreds of cars, you need an assembly line that is very expensive to build and maintain, a lot of the smaller guys get crowded out and gobbled up. And by the 1920s, there are only 3 automakers in America. We went from hundreds of automakers to just 3. And they controlled the industry. Same thing happens in film. In the early 20th century, there are a lot of film producers, a lot of film companies making films, again, geared towards working class audiences in the silent era. But when film becomes mainstream and big business, by the end of the 1920s, there are only 5 studios in America. We go from hundreds of studios to just 5, a process of consolidation. Most Americans in the 1920s lived on credit. Most Americans in the 1920s racked up high consumer debt, enjoying the pleasures of consumerism and hoping to postpone the pain. Few Americans had much in terms of savings. There were many Americans who were foreclosed, denied a chance to build wealth, and there were others who could have had that opportunity but did not. Instead, believing that this roaring, booming economy would last forever, they went into debt and bought cars and suburban homes. There was a hidden America that would later be increasingly exposed with the ravages and deprivations of the Great Depression. People who lived under the poverty line. Farmers who lived a more desperate existence, far away from the glamorous cities of the 1920s. People in America who didn't have access to electricity, heat, running water in the rural South or in the West. They weren't as visible in the glamorous culture of the 1920s, but they were part of an America where they stood outside the reaches of the consumer economy. With greater efficiencies, with greater productivity, with the advent of machines and an assembly line that could mass produce consumer goods, you actually had layoffs, a process of deindustrialization that, of course, will later be so consequential in American economic and consumer cultural history in the late 20th century began in the 1920s with different forms of automation and greater efficiencies that meant layoffs for people who were no longer needed in factories. Despite the availability of some consumer goods, again, there's sort of an invisible America who we need to be mindful of in this period, who don't have radios and washing machines and vacuum cleaners. Even with cheap cars, many Americans could not afford the automobile. So the last of the limits that we engage in this second lecture on the 1920s, that's again designed to make the 1920s more vivid, more real, and being more complex in your imagination, are these limits we might associate with class or resources. Americans who couldn't afford the good life, Americans who struggled to attain these markers of affluence and could only do so through debt. A small group of Americans who are aggrandizing their wealth and power in this period. And while the economy was still booming and roaring, when America seemed to be in the throes and thickets of a great economic revival in the 1920s, when it seemed like a rising tide was lifting all boats, when Americans were worshiping businessmen as gods who made the gadgets and gizmos, a lot of this would remain invisible. But then the stock market crashes. Then there are shocks in the banking and housing industries. Then factories begin to close. And you have the beginning of this great disaster, this great depression, when what was once invisible now bubbles to the surface, when the experiences of the impoverished become commonplace. And as we'll see in our next lecture, that will lead to another shift in American consumer culture. A return to progressive era sensibilities, a more regulatory approach, a deep suspicion about big business, and a recalibration of values. If this is a class about consumer culture, it's about the way in which consumerism is freighted and loaded with values. The Great Depression will urge a recalibration of those values once the failings, the limits of the 1920s are so exposed. In a Great Depression, that is our focus in our next lecture.